You're still watching the live post-budget speech analysis. I'm your host, Zinati Guma. And for the next 30 minutes, we'll be examining the Finance Minister's budget speech through the lens of South African political landscape. Much has been made prior to the speech about the strategic aptitude that's linked to the advancement of certain policies in an election year. And with the minister announcing the increases to income grants as well as the allocation of 1.4 billion rand to the NHI grant in the midterm, a figure of 57.8 billion rand to critical services and the amendment of the public procurement bill, which is centered on transformation measures and triple BEE, much of that political discourse is surely set to continue. And we bring it to you first as I'm joined right now by political analysts Booysen, Ongama Mtimka and Daniel Silke. Thank you so much for your time. Of course, this budget quite important because it happens ahead of the elections. But how many months are we from the election? Of course, that has been announced to be on the 29th of May. So really, one of the factors setting the tone for voters. Now, in terms of what voters are looking for, starting with you, Daniel, in the social wage. How far has it gone?
Yeah, thank you for having me. Well, I think this budget managed to do with very little what is probably barely enough for South Africa's voters. In other words, this was a budget which had empty pockets, and the Minister of Finance really had to stretch those pockets as far as he could to an increasingly suspicious voting core. And I think ultimately that was the aim of the budget. So whilst the minister will tell you this was not a pre-election budget, it was a pre-election budget because for most South Africans, they will be concerned about their pockets. They'll be concerned about the security of social grants in particular. And I think that this budget will have reassured a portion of the ANC electorate or those wavering potentially that they will still receive some security from government.
Yeah, I mean, just talking about that security, of course, we have to zoom into the social relief of distress grant that is still 350. Of course, we did hear from the president that he would be working on an extension and an improvement. Here we did get an extension, but not an improvement. And I actually want to come to Susan. I don't know if she is still with us. I'm not seeing her right now. Okay, let me go to you, Ongama. In terms of that extension, but not improvement, how much of a needle mover is that for that population segment's confidence in the governing party?
So this was a contingency measure when it was introduced, a relief measure. And the lingering question among the labor movements and progressive organizations in the country has always been how long is government going to carry this grant, because the left sees it as part of initiatives to fight for a basic income grant. And this government was always going to be judged by whether or not it decides to stop it. And in the last 3 years or so, it has continued to extend it precisely because it knows that the public gaze, particularly the leftist gaze, is one of you touch that grant and you're going to see how we are going to respond as the society at large. But I quite noticed that it is not being increased. What has happened, though, is that the rest of the grants have seen marginal increases. And I think that it will not make South Africans very happy, but as given the context, it's something which was a tough balancing act to keep a social security net that is still that still borders on what's the acceptable side of the fiscal choices that the minister had.
Yeah. And yeah, Daniel, I mean, obviously you mentioned the fact that there seems to be quite a lot of electioneering involved in that budget. And of course, the minister saying that more details on the improvement of that SRD grant will be available in April, a month before the elections. But he says, though, that, this extension, will be within the current fiscal framework. Is that possible at this point?
Well, I think much of...
Yeah, you can go, Daniel, yes?
Now, I think much of what was said in the broader budget, not only on this issue, really is predicated upon an improvement in the broader growth for the South African economy, plus revenue collections down the line. Now, we've seen revised revenue collections down. We've seen a very lackluster or pretty grim GDP projection, certainly the last year and into this year and even into next year. And I think that many of these sort of promises made, and once again, we've seen promises. That's why ultimately, to me, it is a political budget, what we've seen. Many of these promises are really going to have to be based upon a concrete improvement in our broader economy performance, policy performance, and improvement in governance as well. And you won't be able to make any hard and fast future projections on so many aspects of what I've seen, unless the basic good governance is restored to South Africa. So I have to say that I found what was said will placate a body of South Africans. But I must say that in terms of some of the benefits to poorer South Africans, these are very shallow. And they're shallow because the minister didn't have much to work with, and they will be taken, government will be taken to task, particularly by leftist movements, particularly by the EFF, and you saw their reaction in the budget this afternoon in Parliament to these very shallow benefits that the state are offering. But then again, if that's all the state has, that's all the state can offer. And that was the balancing act ultimately for Gonongwana today. He managed to pull this through, but whether it's going to pull the ANC through at the polls remains to be seen.
Yeah, actually, because, yeah, you're right. Not a lot of information available there, saying that whatever, comes out, whatever is underway will be published in April. And of course, even saying that even with an extension of this grant beyond 2025, we'll need an additional revenue source. Ongama, in a lack of a better word, was this all just smoke and mirrors, fugazi?
I beg your pardon?
Was it smoke and mirrors? I mean, just, all these words that, there's, more information will be coming out in April, and even for the extension of the SRD grant beyond 2025, that will need a new revenue source when there seem to be no prospects at this point.
I think there's real political issues there. So one, the government knows that it's not at liberty to willy-nilly discontinue the grant. That's the one thing, based on the strong lobby to even actually make it to become a basic income grant. So that's the issue, and it's not a question of whether or not some form of relief for the unemployed will be there. It's a question of the modalities. So I think part of the reason this grant is being delayed as to the final decision on it is that the government wants to see whether there is leeway for them to get closer to basic income grant. This is the core message of the ANC in the short term, because you have unemployment that is at appalling levels, mid-30s to early 40s, depending on who you believe. So it's not something that's easy for them. So I think that it's smoke and mirrors as far as what the final word is on it, but what underlies that tactical approach are real tough political issues.
Yeah. Well, welcome back, Susan. Glad to have you back. We see that you disappeared there for a moment. We were just talking about, trying to gauge how much electioneering there was in this budget. Of course, considering the fact that now the elections have been announced to be on the 29th of May. And then also we're talking about the SRD grant specifically. Of course, that segment of the population is also a significant segment for voting, particularly for the governing party. So just in your view, how much of a firm hand do you think Treasury had in this budget? Or maybe was the hand more the ANC's?
Well, it's kind of very difficult to differentiate between the two, because they do work very closely hand in hand. And yes, it's all very, very consultative. But there is a very strong political hand evident there. Perhaps also, after one noticed that all other taxpayer and voter electorate blocks have been ticked there. The grand dependees, middle classes, business to some extent, reassurances about infrastructure. And there are so many of those boxes that have been ticked to make sure that the ANC as government here does not alienate many constituencies in a run-up to the election. So it's definitely close cooperation there. And it also strikes me that this could be the budget for a political party that envisages the possibility of going into coalition government post-election. It doesn't have, I think it tries not to overextend, not to overcommit. I think here, for example, of national health insurance and very minuscule token allocation at this stage, being presented by the Minister of Finance as a sign of the commitment of the ANC to this project. And I think that is the kind of message that is written all over this budget speech that we heard today. And yes, a government that might have to negotiate with other political parties come after the election, and also knowing even if in that small chance at this stage that he does return to power without coalition government, that it has not overextended itself even further, given the limited sources of income, overextended in terms of making the ideal, good sounding, pretty election promises, and then realizing it cannot possibly meet the budgets that are required for those.
Yeah, just sticking with you, Susan, we have less than a minute before we go to break. But just looking at this budget and also just how much political influence was in it at this point, do you think it is significantly needle moving for the voter, or it's maybe just a message, just an idea that the government is putting in the voter's head?
No, I don't think it's overly alienating to the voter because of all the good sentiments that they have tried to put forward in the document, and also the opening and the closing remarks by the minister, emphasizing that the ANC's commitment to trying to grow the pie and to redistribute and giving all the little markers. So I think they try to cover their bases. Definitely, if the voters are prepared to listen to that, but on the ground, the concrete details for a struggling set of public voters out there, there is very little meat that is being delivered. For those who are really struggling and who are in poverty, etc., I don't think this budget is going to hold out much promise that the fates may be changing.
I do want to go to that foreign exchange account. So Treasury says that it will be drawing down 150 billion from the gold and foreign exchange contingency reserve account. This has been quite polarizing. Daniel, just coming to you, does this underpin political pressure, or was it just a sensible thing to do at this point?
Well, I didn't hear your question completely, but I think that, the drawdown here, is probably, again, manageable for South Africa under current conditions. Look, it's a rainy day fund that South Africa did have. At some point, you need to use it. Now, again, we return to the issue of the political imperative here, because this does give this budget a kind of good news veneer. And that's what it is, a good news veneer, because this drawdown is quite substantial. But if the drawdown itself and if the use is not effective over the course of the next 2 to 3 or 4 budget years, we'll be even in a more precarious fiscal cliff come 2027, 2028. So once again, I think we've seen a sort of kicking the can down the road with some sort of contingency reserve that can be used in exceptional circumstances. The question is, if we didn't have an election this year, would we have used that contingency reserve? And would we have rather kept it for a real, a serious crisis that any country in the world can face? And I think is an election, is the political survival of the ANC the ultimate crisis that has forced us to use this particular contingency reserve? And I think that question does have to be asked.
Well then, coming to you, Ongama, could we see more pressure on getting money out of that account for more spending?
That's quite interesting. So we should look at the fiscal choices within context. So initially, when that was announced, there was an immediate linking of a positive response as far as rand strength to that news earlier today. I don't know whether that kind of corrected at some stage. What that was about to me is that a finance minister faced with very difficult choices ended up going for the least offensive, if you like, choice based on the practical realities of the moment. Now, you're quite right in asking this question of it's contingency funds, and part of the reason why the ANC has employed this strategy, it's because it didn't want any other fiscal option. Didn't want to increase VAT, didn't want to increase personal income taxes, certainly didn't want to increase corporate taxes. So the options that it has were the usual sin taxes and doing something of this nature. The question, and I think that's pertinent, becomes if you can withdraw these funds for what can be described as ordinary expenditure, what stops you from doing it again? And the implications of that become, the next time we do it, it won't be a positive response from the markets. And it will be one of concern about a potential ransacking of the fund.
Actually, just on that, because, both you and Daniel really question, the direction of this money, and even if, what this money could be used for and if it will be effective. And I actually want to go to the question, Susan. I mean, looking at our spending priorities right now, are we directing our limited resources to the right things?
Well, if one looks at simply the immediate urgent task, and that is to balance your budget, yes, sure. But overall, my answer is no, because if these are important resources and used very rarely, I believe the last time that those funds were dipped into was about 20 years ago. And ideally, it should really be spent on infrastructure capital expenditures to go in that direction so that there's something to show for it, because it is not an endless reserve. And so I think it is very problematic that it is used to cover current expenditures. And yes, we could possibly already have been there in the previous years, but we know in previous budgets, South Africa was kind of saved by the rise in commodity prices. And now there is no rise in the commodity prices to fall back onto. So it is a crisis that arose now, but I think it is worrisome that it is not being used in more sustainable, endurable forms of expenditure.
Daniel, would you say that our spending is more survivalist than productive?
Well, I think it is. I mean, if you drill down into that budget review and you look at the perilous state of gross fixed capital formation in South Africa in particular, and there's some pretty telling charts, which are the ones that are of real interest, by the way. What's really interesting is in that book, very often that's not presented by the president when he presents his state of the nation. The real state of the nation is in the budget handbook, and I urge viewers to look into that in more detail. But on that basis, yes, I mean, this is not a productive economy. It's become an economy that really has created a large dependent population, and you've swapped productivity for dependency in South Africa. Now, how you get yourself out of that mess is indeed complex, because we've spent 20, 25 years, 30 years getting into this particular mess. But nevertheless, I do think that some of the measures introduced in the budget this afternoon, I think the public-private participation encouragement, the incentives, I think those are positives. Those can move South Africa in a better direction than where we've come from. But the issue is clearly it all falls back again on our very poor growth rates, the inability to take unemployment away from being dramatically severe in this country and making any dent on that. And of course, the inability also to spend all of the allocations that we discuss prudently and efficiently with best practice policies. And you can have all of the allocations that you want, whether it's education, whether it's social services, whether it's NHI, if the spending is not efficient, if the policy parameters are weak or are ideologically based or patronage based, well, it's just another series of figures on paper and your growth remains static or indeed very poor.
Yeah. Ongama, would you say that, we have, enough fiscal capacity to actually be productive with our spending, or that's just not a question in the backdrop of the weak economic growth?
So I agree with the sentiment that it's not enough. So the minister, interestingly, mentions the planned capital investment by government of just under $1 trillion, about 57 billion, shy of $1 trillion in terms of infrastructure spending. I quite liked the references to cooperation with the private sector in terms of investments. But to your question, I just remembered now. So what I wanted to talk about was he makes reference to costs of purchasing a computer equipment. Now, you can say that about medicine. You can say that about education. You can say that about every sector. And what it points to is the idea that beyond strategy and allocations and intentions, you need an effective leadership, situational as well as visionary, to be able, for example, to drive a cost reduction exercise. And to do that, you don't need these broad pronouncements that National Treasury usually makes: cancel road trips, this, that, and the other, travel and all of those things. But you need a laser-focused approach to expenditure. Whether government gets value for money, we know that it does not get value for money for items. There are times when government spends 250 per toilet paper roll, among other things. So it calls for greater effective leadership across the civil service, where efficiencies can be found as far as expenditure is concerned, so that there can be confidence that government is actually able to control costs when it is faced with these challenges of not having enough money. I know people have spoken about insourcing, and I don't think that insourcing is the best strategy to deal with these middlemen and all of those things. Because remember, once a government starts insourcing everything, then it bears the cost of retaining labor, even when that labor is not being used, for example, on construction projects.
Yeah.
What's required, though, is to eliminate corruption. And I'm happy about the funding that's been allocated to the Justice Ministry around state capture crimes, among other things.
Ongama talks about a laser-focused approach on expenditure, and of course, because we don't have a lot of income, we constantly have to be cutting expenditure, and actually saying that he will reduce non-interest expenditure by 80.6 billion rand in the medium term. That is less than the 85 billion rand that had been said in the medium-term budget. Susan, it is an election year. How much muscle does Treasury have to actually stick to these expenditure cuts and ceilings?
Yes, it is certainly election year, and this is in many ways written all over this speech today. Soft trading on so many fronts, making sure you do not alienate voters, giving a significant additional amount to the IEC to help ensure credible, legitimate elections. So those are certainly very important points. And interesting, related to this, also additional 200 million to political parties. We will still hear what the independents say about that, and whether that leads to any inequalities, further inequalities there. And so, but in election year, it is certainly not the kind of budget that a strong governing party would have liked to present, because there are not strong announcements, there are not strong new solutions being funded that could help seriously address the problems that we have. There are several unfolding programs and commitment to continue funding to advance those projects. But there is no solution that I heard in this project, and that is, of course, related to the state of the nation address, but no further elaboration here that would have given her reassurances that yes, there is definitive attention, laser sharp attention that is being given to driving at further advancing the solutions to possible problems. So it's rather depressing election year speech, given that this is probably the very best that the ANC as governing party has available to offer, and that speaks to the dire financial and fiscal situations that South Africa is in.
And on that note, we do wrap up the conversation. Thank you so much for your time and for your very interesting insights that, of course, we will be thinking about as we go to elections. Thank you, lady and gents. Those were political analysts Susan Booysen, Ongama Mtimka, and Daniel Silke.